Oh, hello everyone, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. It is the Saturday live stream, and there's another one on Sunday, although that one, for reasons unknown to me, is not called the Saturday live stream. So, welcome. And today I want to sort of carry on from where I left off on one of the shorter videos that I posted during the week. And this is all about AI music. And I would say that while most people think that AI music is really a current thing and that the technology behind it isn't very old, I would make the argument that it is around 150 years old. It's been around for a while. And to understand what I mean by this, we have to take a look at what AI music really means. What AI means? Well, it obviously means artificial intelligence. And this is essentially machinery. And by today's parlance, by today's terminology, it means a computer derived technology that is able to mimic human behavior, that is able to serve human needs the way that our fellow humans would otherwise have done, and produce results that are humanoid in nature. Hopefully, that's a good enough definition. So let's look at music. And as I've said before, to really go back to this, you have to imagine an era, one not all that long ago in the terms of the wider history of the world, an era when, in order to hear music, there was no other way to do it. You needed to be in the physical presence, or at least within earshot, of a human musician. And that includes yourself, because you could always play yourself a song on the guitar, piano, oboe, trumpet, what have you. You could sing yourself. But there needed to be a human. Music was not produced by anything that wasn't human, or in the case of birds, you could say animal. But it needed to be, as Jeff Lynne would say, a living thing. What a terrible thing to lose. But if you couldn't find it in the first place, a lot of people in the 19th century started thinking about the next best thing. And this next best thing was music without musicians. And the way that this was initially achieved was through the self playing instrument. And the first self playing instruments that really became noteworthy in the 19th century were organs. You had them at fairgrounds, in merry-go-rounds, carousels. You had them at dance halls. You had some, well, they weren't really portable, but they were big ones that would be played at an outdoor fair or other sort of major event. And these mechanical instruments worked on something called rolls. Now, a roll was a piece of paper with little holes in it, a bit like the Braille alphabet, a bit like feeling a Braille book. And the machine would read it, and the little holes punched in these rolls would tell the machine what notes to play and on what instruments, because some of these fairground organs and dance hall organs were huge and incredibly sophisticated. They had not only organ pipes, but they had percussion instruments that could be triggered by what was on the roll. They had wind instruments. They had all sorts of pitched instruments, and as well as percussion instruments. They had the whole lot of them. And you can still see some of these around at some of the older merry-go-rounds or fairgrounds, and they're quite extraordinary. Now, the first thing that someone might notice if you're comparing it and contrasting it to early recorded sound is that these instruments, these self-playing instruments, sounded perfect because they were the real instruments. They were the instruments that could otherwise be played by a human hand, but they were connected to these mechanical devices that allowed them to play themselves. Music outside of the presence of a musician. And this was really extraordinary. Now, why do I call it artificial intelligence? Well, because it is allowing something mechanical to create an artistic experience, to deliver content to people that would otherwise need to be performed by a human musician. The other reason that I consider this AI is that all AI, at least all of the AI that we have today, it needs to start with the human input at some point. When you ask ChatGPT what happened in the news today, I mean, I realize that it's not updated in real time, but let's just hypothetically say so. It would base that knowledge based on stories written or things that are on YouTube or other video platforms. It will base its response based on the input that at some point that first link in the chain was a human being telling, either in writing or orally, what happened in the news. What makes the AI unique isn't that it can think for itself per se. What's interesting about the AI is that it can process human information that is relayed to it, in this case in an electrical digital format, and come up with a answer to your query. This I want to know. I don't know what are Donald Trump and Kamala Harris doing, and the AI will look at a chain of things that it's scraping from the web, and at the beginning of that chain, no matter how long the chain might be, there was a human involved in relaying the story and in creating the story. Because after all, it's not asking what robots are doing; it's asking what Trump and Harris are doing, and those are people. In Biden's case, maybe there is a bit of robot in there, but no, it's all about the original human link in the chain. And such was the case with these music roles. It was a human musician that played the instruments to create what was on the roll, and it was a human composer which created the melody, the rhythms, the harmonies that go into the music on that roll. Now, these big fairground organs and dance hall organs were obviously things for commercial enterprises. Few other than some really, really wealthy people had them in their home. But it was at the end of the 19th century that the most important invention in terms of the consuming public to provide music without being in the physical presence of a musician came along. And this was the player piano. And the player piano was really, really popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries because it allowed people who weren't musicians themselves to hear music in their home without inviting in or paying a band to come in and play. This was revolutionary. And when you compare it to the recorded sound that existed at this same time in the form of Thomas Edison's wax cylinders, the sound was high fidelity. So not only, like I said the other day, did high fidelity sound exist in the 19th century, but so too did artificial intelligence. The player piano and the self-playing organs, which were of course very large, they were both early examples of pre-digital and in some cases pre-electrical AI, and they were also very much the first versions of high fidelity for the home. And this can explain why the player piano was much more popular to have in your home than a device that would play Edison's wax cylinders, because while the wax cylinders were recordings of actual musicians, the sound was awful, the fidelity was low. Having a player piano in your home meant that you could hear an actual piano. In terms of the sonics themselves, they were every bit as good as hearing a live pianist. You were missing some of the intonation, obviously. You were missing the spontaneity. You were missing, in that sense, two major components that make up musical artistry. But what you weren't missing was the sonics themselves, because a player piano, whether your finger is hitting the key or whether the mechanical device is hitting down the key, is going to sound sonically the same. And even though recorded sound improved vastly in the 1920s with the advent of electrical recording, now we're in the age of the microphone, we're in the age of shellac discs, we're in the age of optical film sound, and things improve a lot. The fidelity was still scratchy and considerably lower, really considerably lower than what you would hear on a player piano or a self-playing organ. Now, in the 1930s, recorded sound as we understand it took a huge leap forward. And this was because of the invention of the magnetic tape in Germany. The German company that made the tape recorders and playback machines was called Magnetophone. And once they experimented with it, corrected for AC DC bias, all of that type of thing, we were getting some really high quality recording. And by the 1940s, you even had stereophonic magnetic recording. And while most of those recordings were sadly lost because there was a war going on at the time, we do have a few. There's a wonderful stereophonic recording of Beethoven's Fifth Piano Concerto being played by one of my very favorite pianists. He's on my list of the greatest pianists of all time. And this is Walter Geskerling. And the orchestra was conducted by my all-time favorite, along with Mengelberg, Wilhelm Furtwängler. So that recording exists. And another recording exists of the fourth movement of Bruckner's Eighth Symphony, conducted by a comparatively young Herbert von Karajan. And you can tell that even though this was literally ground zero for stereophonic sound, the quality was really, really high. And this explains why the self-playing instrument by the mid-20th century went from being something of a novelty. I mean, pardon me, it went from being an essential component of the listening experience for people who want to receive music outside of the presence of a musician to, like I said, a more novel experience. Because what do we have happening in the 1950s? Well, magnetic tape becomes mainstream, both as a recording medium and increasingly for the home audiophile. The magnetic tape, the pre-recorded magnetic tape sold to high fidelity consumers in the 50s was really when I would say the audiophile movement was born. Because while we had the LP since the 40s, which was a huge sonic and convenience improvement over the 78 shellac disc, and by the late 50s we have the stereophonic LP, which was an improvement over the monaural LP, for truly great sound in the home in the 50s, 60s, and frankly beyond in many ways. It was these pre-recorded tapes that the major labels and some specialty audiophile labels like Westminster put out in the 50s and 60s. So if you want to see what killed this artificial intelligence, these robot instruments that played themselves, you could say that magnetic tape is where that happened. And magnetic tape, while it sort of qualifies under some definitions of AI in the sense that it's a machine reproducing a human experience, I would say that it's one step removed from the player piano and self-playing organ in terms of this retrospective definition of AI. Because a recording is literally just a carbon copy of something. It's a sonic copy of a moment in time, typically music, but also, of course, spoken word, in the same way that film and later video are copies of an audio visual moment that happened in time. Well, of course, film was first just visual and then they put sound with it, but let's not get too bogged down in those details. And so because of that, the self-playing instrument, this proto AI, kind of retreated from the public consciousness in the mid 20th century, although you could still find a lot of these instruments in places where people enjoy novelties. There were still bars around and even restaurants around with player pianos. There was a chain of ice cream parlors that opened in the 70s in the US called Farrell's, and they had player pianos, not because they hadn't heard of the fact that you could set up a PA system and play records and tapes or the radio, but because it was a novelty by now. It was no longer an essentialist way to hear music without a musician. It was part of the scenery. But because humans are they've always been fascinated with robots and machinery. Not all of us, of course. I mean, some of us are more inclined to a more naturalistic or Luddite way of thinking of things, but a huge segment of the human contingent has always been exceedingly interested in the machines and the power of machines. It's what has inspired a lot of fantasy about how machines can help improve human life, and it's also been the subject of a lot of horror fantasy sci-fi. Think Isaac Asimov, I, Robot. And even though it's funny, Will Smith knew that the robots were coming to kill us all, but he didn't know about Chris Rock's deadly punchline, which shows that you can't rely on robots or the knowledge thereof for everything. Send your complaints to the chat below. So, a lot of these instruments now are sort of viral online because of their novelty. But I also think that one of the reasons they're so viral is unconsciously, a lot of us kind of sort of know that there is a relationship between these lumbering mechanical instruments invented in the 19th century and made up through the early 20th century and the kind of digital technology that fascinates people today. For instance, Huell Hauser was a public television star in California. Adam Carolla makes fun of him a lot. The late, great Huell Hauser, very, very fun guy. And a video that he did while he was living, of course, went viral relatively recently. And it's in that sort of circle of virality. It goes viral every now and then. And this is of a man playing an instrument called the American Photo Player. And the musician who is famous for playing it is a man called Joe Renaudo. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now, this is a hybrid between a self-playing instrument and an instrument that requires human input, which is why it's so interesting to watch. It has these large rolls which control multiple mechanically played instruments. It's got a piano, it's got organ, it's got all sorts of other percussion, and the human element is to play the percussive sound effects. And this was initially designed for cinema because before you had talking pictures, aka sound recordings to accompany the film, you would have either in a big cinema, you would have a live musician playing a theater organ made by companies like Wurlitzer, which were very, very interesting devices. And some of those had semi-automated features as well. And we're talking long before the computer. Some of the smaller cinemas would have a player piano or one of these photo players, and there would be a musician or even someone just with a knowledge of rhythm who would manipulate the sound effects manually. So if there was a train coming, you'd pull on the chain that makes the train whistle in this instrument blow. If there was someone falling down the stairs, the whistle, the slide whistle, and all of these other things. And this video of this man, Joe, playing it, you'll recognize Huell Hauser going, "Hit it, Joe," and he goes, and it's wild and fun. But again, this was AI because the majority of the sounds emanating from that instrument are being played via artificial intelligence. And so, what is AI music today? Well, AI music today relies still on a human input. In this case, it's the human input that it receives through traditional recorded sound. And the technology based on these large AI language models can manipulate sound to create an original composition, but one based on several layers of human input. It's, of course, based on the original recording, and it's based on a human, could be you or me, telling the AI in the form of a prompt to create a kind of song or a piece of music, whatever, that exhibits certain styles. And a lot of them are very humorous. That's where I think this AI music, at least for now, really excels. There is a YouTube channel that I follow that's very funny, that has people sort of crossing styles. So one of them that I find really funny is someone used AI to create a version of Tupac's "Hit 'Em Up," one of the most violent diss songs ever at the heart of the East Coast West Coast rap war. And they said, do it in the style of a 1950s doo-wop record, and it is hilarious. And you've got Frank Sinatra, AI Frank Sinatra, singing death metal songs, and it's all very, very interesting and funny. But there's also a part of this modern day musical AI that isn't about parody, even though some of the results are unintentionally humorous. Some of the results, though, are quite intentionally accurate. When you say, write me a song based on the style of, a pinch of Taylor Swift, a bit of Dua Lipa, and a bit of Billie Eilish. I want something that combines their styles with an upbeat kind of of an upbeat kind of feeling. You could give the AI a prompt as simple as that, and it would come up with something. In fact, Rick Beato often plays these, and a lot of the time he's actually very surprised at how good they are. Some of it, he says, are frankly even better than some of the stuff on the radio, on the Spotify top 10 and top 20 today. And this leads us to the question of, are we going to be in an iRobot future? Is iTunes going to become iRobot, in the sense that will humans as the creators and performers of music go away? I think not, because again, the AI is really only there to replicate, and it does exhibit some creative abilities, but I would say that at best these are pseudo creative abilities. The real originality, the real concepts always have to come from the human mind, because the human mind, while capable of mathematic thought, the human mind, more importantly, is capable of thinking outside the box. The human mind is capable of breaking through the algorithm. The human mind is capable of saying, to hell with imitation, I'm going to do something original, bearing in mind that all forms of originality begin with attempts at imitation. It's the old line, learn everything about music and then forget it in order to be original. But you have to do the one in order to accomplish the other. With the AI, it's sort of stuck in this imitation loop where the more you force it to be creative, you're not really making it be creative. You're just moving its latest computation further down the link in this chain. And the link in the chain where this computation takes place is much further down the line than the initial source, which is a human composing and a human playing music. But that is always the beginning, because even when machines learn from other machines, they call it, surprisingly enough, machine learning. Always, the first link in the chain is always going to be a human, and that human's creative output into the world. So when, for instance, AI music programs learn from studying other AI music files, those files had to come from somewhere. Maybe they came from other AI generated music files. But if you go back far enough, the first point on the timeline is always going to be human creativity. So I think the more important question isn't, is AI going to replace musicians? But the question is, what do we as humans value in our music? If we only value it for a sort of background underscore, something that never takes center stage in terms of our concentration and in terms of our emotional engagement, we'll get to the stage where we can admit that AI generated music might not be as creative as the best music of all time, but that it's sufficient enough to exist in the background while other activities and other thoughts are transpiring. But if we truly value music, AI is never going to be a substitution. Maybe for elevator music, maybe for music in a commercial, but never a substitution for the kinds of music that take center stage. When someone like me, or maybe like you watching this, really wants to hear good music, you're probably not going to listen to AI music, even as the AI gets increasingly sophisticated. You're going to want to hear human creativity, whether it's recent human creativity or human creativity from a distant past. And so, in this sense, I think that AI, much like the self playing instruments of the 19th and early 20th century, will actually influence music less than recorded technology and things like venue sizes and things like the instruments themselves. Because something that is based purely on mechanical imitation and emulation will never take the place of the creative process. This, of course, isn't to say that the creative process isn't influenced by technology and by things like architecture, something that isn't music. We talked in a previous stream about how in the 19th century, orchestras became bigger and they became better because they had to learn to fill larger concert halls, which themselves were created as a response to the increasing democratization of music access in 19th century Europe. And we talked also on on that previous stream about how Richard Wagner was someone who really was one of the first great heroes of music who helped to democratize the musical experience for audiences. And then we talked about how recorded sound influenced music. The LP's length created the concept album. Let's have 45 at the most 50 minutes of cohesive music rather than a symphony that could be as long as a Brucknerian symphony or a song which is just a few minutes long. But because the LP had this unusual length, one that, yes, could accommodate one symphony, but since most music is by definition pop music, which is a song, or a collection of songs, the idea was let's make a collection of songs that's cohesive. The concept album. That's an example of the LP's length influencing the way that musicians composed and performed. And likewise, today, now that the physical media is totally removed from the listening experience for most people, the question is not one of being constrained by length one way or the other. And the result is that the single is kind of back. It turns out that when left to their own devices and when every song ever recorded is more or less available on streaming services, a lot of people will opt for the 3-minute song rather than the 45-minute album. So what goes around really comes around, whether it's that or whether it's this AI music. But what this just shows is that for all of the panic that every generation fears when a seemingly new or novel technology comes along, just remember other generations felt the same. People were worried that the player piano would put pianists out of business. It didn't. People were worried that the self-playing organ would put organists out of business. It didn't, because there is always this need for human interaction. I'm not saying that these didn't have an economic effect on the employability of live musicians, just as the discotheque, you could say, had an effect, just as the synthesizer meant that you could have fewer people on stage or in a recording studio creating sounds that were just as lush and big and powerful as what you would have needed more physical human musicians to do. So there is that impact, but the total doom and gloom of AI or its related technologies, its sisters and cousins, just killing off live music or killing off human music composition, I don't see that happening. Why? It didn't happen before. But let me know what you think. It's an interesting topic. There's really no right or wrong answers because all we're doing is a bit of prognostication. So, as always, you humans out there, or your bots, because maybe I'm being listened to by some bots who are trying to get inside my head, and that in a few years' time, there'll be a sort of robot music box that you'll be liking and subscribing to on YouTube. But until then, like and subscribe to me. Share it with your friends, human or otherwise. Dogs and cats welcome, robots too. We'll see you next time. Take care.